Country music is a genre of United States popular music that originated in the southern United States in the 1920s. It takes its roots from the southeastern genre of United States such as folk music, blues music, and western music. Blues modes have been used extensively throughout its recorded history. Country music often consists of ballads and dance tunes with generally simple forms and harmonies accompanied by mostly string instruments such as banjos, electric and acoustic guitars, dobros and fiddles, as well as harmonicas. The term country music gained popularity in the 1940s in preference to the earlier term hillbilly music. It came to encompass western music, which evolved parallel to hillbilly music from similar roots in the mid-20th century. The term country music is used today to describe many styles and subgenres. The origins of country music are the folk music of mostly white working-class Americans, who blended popular songs, Irish and Celtic fiddle tunes, traditional ballads, and cowboy songs, and various musical traditions from European immigrant communities. In 2009, country music was the most listened to rush hour radio genre during the evening commute, and second most popular in the morning commute in the United States. Generations of country music. Immigrants to the southern Appalachian Mountains of North America brought the music and instruments of Europe along with them for nearly 300 years. Country music was introduced to the world as a southern phenomenon. The first generation emerged in the early 1920s, with Atlanta's music scene playing a major role in launching country's earliest recording artists. OK Records began issuing hillbilly music records by Fiddle and John Carson as early as 1923, followed by Columbia Records in 1924, and RCA Victor Records in 1927. Many hillbilly musicians, such as Cliff Carlisle, recorded blues songs throughout the 1920s. During the second generation, radio became a popular source of entertainment, and barn dance shows featuring country music were started all over the South, as far north as Chicago and as far west as California. The most important was the Grand Ole Opry, aired starting in 1925 by WSM in Nashville and continuing to the present day. During the 1930s and 1940s, cowboy songs, or Western music, which had been recorded since the 1920s, were popularized by films made in Hollywood. Bob Wills was another country musician from the lower Great Plains who had become very popular as the leader of a hot string band, and who also appeared in Hollywood westerns. His mix of country and jazz, which started out as dance hall music, would become known as Western swing. Wills was one of the first country musicians known to have added an electric guitar to his band. In 1938, country musicians began recording boogie in 1939, shortly after it had been played at Carnegie Hall, when Johnny Barfield recorded Boogie Woogie. The third generation started at the end of World War II with mountaineer string band music known as bluegrass, which emerged when Bill Monroe, along with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs, were introduced by Roy Acuff at the Grand Ole Opry. Gospel music remained a popular component of country music, another type of stripped-down and raw music with a variety of moods and a basic ensemble of guitar, bass, dobro, steel guitar. Drums became popular, especially among poor whites in Texas and Oklahoma. It became known as honky-tonk, and had its roots in western swing and the ranchero music of Mexico and the border states. By the early 1950s, a blend of western swing, country boogie, and honky-tonk was played by most country bands. Rockabilly was most popular with country fans in the 1950s, and 1956 could be called the year of rockabilly in country music, beginning in the mid-1950s and reaching its peak during the early 1960s. 1960s, the Nashville sound turned country music into a multi-million-dollar industry centered in Nashville, Tennessee. The late 1960s in American music produced a unique blend as a result of traditionalist backlash within separate genres. In the aftermath of the British invasion, many desired a return to the old values of rock and roll. At the same time, there was a lack of enthusiasm in the country sector for Nashville-produced music. What resulted was a crossbred genre known as country rock. Fourth-generation music included outlaw country with roots in the Bakersfield sound, and country pop with roots in the countrypolitan, folk music and soft rock. Between 1972 and 1975, singer-guitarist John Denver released a series of hugely successful songs blending country and folk rock musical styles. During the early 1980s, country artists continued to see the records perform well on the pop charts. In 1980, a style of neo-country disco music was popularized. During the mid-1980s, a group of new artists began to emerge who rejected the more polished country pop sound that had been prominent on radio and the charts in favor of more traditional back-to-basics production. During the fifth generation, country music became a worldwide phenomenon thanks to Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson. The Dixie Chicks became one of the most popular country bands in the 1990s and early 2000s. The sixth generation is exemplified by country singer Carrie Underwood. The influence of rock music in country has become more overt during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Attempts to combine punk and country were pioneered by Jason and the Scorches, and in the 1980s Southern Californian cowpunk scene with bands like the Long Riders. Hip-hop also made its mark on country music with the emergence of country rap. Most of the best-selling country songs of this era, however, were in the country pop genre, such as those by Lady Antebellum, Florida Georgia Line, and Taylor Swift. First generation. Atlanta's music scene played a major role in launching country's earliest recording artists in the early 1920s. Many Appalachian people had come to the city to work in its cotton mills and brought the music with them. It would remain a major recording center for 2 decades and a major performance center for 4 decades, up to the first country music TV shows on local Atlanta stations in the 1950s. Some record companies in Atlanta turned away early artists such as fiddle and John Carson, while others realized that his music would fit perfectly with the lifestyle of the country's agricultural workers. The first commercial recordings of what was considered country music were Arkansas Traveler and Turkey in the Straw by fiddlers Henry Gilliland and Amp A. C. Robertson on June 30, 1922, for Victor Records and released in April 1923. Columbia Records began issuing records with hillbilly music as early as 1924. A year later, on June 14, 1923, fiddle and John Carson recorded Little Log Cabin in the Lane for OK Records. Vernon Dalhart was the first country singer to have a nationwide hit in May 1924 with Wreck of the Old 97. The flip side of the record was Lonesome Road Blues, which also became very popular. In April 1924, Aunt Samantha Bumgarner and Eva Davis became the first female musicians to record and release country songs. Many hillbilly musicians, such as Cliff Carlisle, recorded blues songs throughout the decade and into the 1930s. Other important early recording artists were Riley Puckett, Don Richardson, fiddle and John Carson, Uncle Dave Macon, Al Hopkins, Ernest V. Stoneman, Charlie Poole and the North Carolina Ramblers and the Skillet Lickers. The steel guitar entered country music as early as 1922, when Jimmy Tarleton met famed Hawaiian guitarist Frank Ferreira on the West Coast. Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family are widely considered to be important early country musicians. The songs were first captured at a historic recording session in Bristol, Tennessee, on August 1, 1927, where Ralph Peer was the talent scout and sound recordist. A scene in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Depicts a similar occurrence in the same time frame. Rogers fused hillbilly country, gospel, jazz, blues, pop, cowboy, and folk, and many of his best songs were his compositions, including Blue Yodel, which sold over 1 million records and established Rogers as the premier singer of early country music. Beginning in 1927, and for the next 17 years, the Carters recorded some 300 old-time ballads, traditional tunes, country songs and gospel hymns, all representative of America's southeastern folklore and heritage. Second-generation record sales declined during the Great Depression, but radio became a popular source of entertainment, and barn dance shows featuring country music were started by radio stations all over the South, as far north as Chicago, and as far west as California. The most important was the Grand Ole Opry, aired starting in 1925 by WSM in Nashville and continuing to the present day. Some of the early stars on the Opry were Uncle Dave Macon, Roy Acuff, and African-American harmonica player DeFord Bailey. WSM's 50,000-watt signal could often be heard across the country. Many musicians performed and recorded songs in any number of styles. Moon Mullican, for example, played western swing but also recorded songs that can be called rockabilly. Between 1947 and 1949, country crooner Eddie Arnold placed 8 songs in the top 10. From 1945 to 1955, Jenny Lou Carson was one of the most prolific songwriters in country music, singing cowboys and western swing during the 1930s and 1940s. Cowboy songs, or western music, which had been recorded since the 1920s, were popularized by films made in Hollywood. Some of the popular singing cowboys from the era were Gene Autry, the Sons of the Pioneers, and Roy Rogers. Country music and western music were frequently played together on the same radio stations, hence the term country and western music. And it wasn't only cowboys. Cowgirls contributed to the sound in various family groups. Patsy Montana opened the door for female artists with her history-making song, I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart. This would begin a movement toward opportunities for women to have successful solo careers. Bob Wills was another country musician from the lower Great Plains who had become very popular as the leader of a hot string band, and who also appeared in Hollywood westerns. His mix of country and jazz, which started out as dance hall music, would become known as western swing. Cliff Bruner, Moon Mullican, Milton Brown, and Adolph Hoffner were other early western swing pioneers. Spade Cooley and Tex Williams also had very popular bands and appeared in films. At its height, western swing rivaled the popularity of big band swing music. Changing instrumentation. Drums were scorned by early country musicians as being too loud and not pure, but by 1935 western swing big band leader Bob Wills had added drums to the Texas Playboys. In the mid-1940s, the Grand Ole Opry did not want the Playboys drummer to appear on stage. Although drums were commonly used by rockabilly groups by 1955, the less conservative than the Grand Ole Opry Louisiana Hayride kept its infrequently used drummer backstage as late as 1956. by the early 1960s. However, it was rare that a country band didn't have a drummer. Bob Wills was one of the first country musicians known to have added an electric guitar to his band. In 1938, a decade later, Arthur Smith achieved top 10 U.S. country chart success with his MGM Records recording of Guitar Boogie, which crossed over to the U.S. pop chart, introducing many people to the potential of the electric guitar. For several decades, Nashville session players preferred the warm tones of the Gibson and Gretsch archtop electrics, but at hot Fender style, using guitars which became available beginning in the early 1950s, eventually prevailed as the signature guitar sound of country. Hillbilly boogie. Country musicians began recording boogie in 1939, shortly after it had been played at Carnegie Hall, when Johnny Barfield recorded Boogie Woogie. The trickle of what was initially called hillbilly boogie, or Okie boogie, became a flood beginning in late 1945. One notable release from this period was the Delmore Brothers' Freight Train Boogie, considered to be part of the combined evolution of country music and blues towards rockabilly. In 1948, Arthur "Guitar Boogie" Smith achieved top 10 U.S. country chart success with his MGM Records recordings of Guitar Boogie and Banjo Boogie, with the former crossing over to the U.S. pop charts. Other country boogie artists included Moon Mullican, Merrill Moore and Tennessee Ernie Ford. The hillbilly boogie period lasted into the 1950s and remains one of many subgenres of country into the 21st century. Bluegrass, folk and gospel. By the end of World War II, mountaineer string band music known as bluegrass had emerged when Bill Monroe joined with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs, introduced by Roy Acuff at the Grand Ole Opry. Gospel music, too, remained a popular component of bluegrass and other sorts of country music. Red Foley, the biggest country star following World War II, had one of the first million-selling gospel hits and also sang boogie, blues and rockabilly. In the post-war period, country music was called folk in the trades, and hillbilly within the industry. In 1944, the Billboard replaced the term hillbilly with folk songs and blues, and switched to country or country and western in 1949. Honky-tonk, another type of stripped-down and raw music with a variety of moods and a basic ensemble of guitar, bass, dobro, steel guitar drums became popular, especially among poor whites in Texas and Oklahoma. It became known as honky-tonk and had its roots in western swing and the ranchero music of Mexico and the border states, particularly Texas. Together with the blues of the American South, Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys personified this music, which has been described as a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of black and a little bit of white, just loud enough to keep you from thinking too much and to go right on ordering the whiskey. East Texan Al Dexter had a hit with Honky Tonk Blues, and 7 years later, Pistol Packin' Mama. These honky tonk songs associated barrooms were performed by the likes of Ernest Tubb, Kitty Wells, Ted Daffan, Floyd Tillman, and the Maddox Brothers, and Rose, Lefty Frizzell and Hank Williams would later be called traditional country. Williams' influence in particular would prove to be enormous, inspiring many of the pioneers of rock and roll, such as Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, as well as Chuck Berry and Ike Turner, while providing a framework for emerging honky-tonk talents like George Jones. Webb Pierce was the top-charting country artist of the 1950s, with 13 of his singles spending 113 weeks at number 1. He charted 48 singles during the decade, 31 reached the top 10 and 26 reached the top 4. Third generation By the early 1950s, a blend of western swing, country boogie, and honky-tonk was played by most country bands. Western music, influenced by the cowboy ballads and Tejano music rhythms of the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico, reached its peak in popularity in the late 1950s, most notably with the song El Paso, first recorded by Marty Robbins in September 1959. The country music scene largely kept the music of the folk revival and folk rock at a distance, despite the similarity in instrumentation and origins. The main concern was politics. The folk revival was largely driven by progressive activists, a stark contrast to the culturally conservative audiences of country music. Only a handful of folk artists, such as Burl Ives, John Denver, and Canadian musician Gordon Lightfoot, would cross over into country music after the folk revival died out. During the mid-1950s, a new style of country music became popular, eventually to be referred to as rockabilly. Rockabilly was most popular with country fans in the 1950s, and 1956 could be called the year of rockabilly in country music. Rockabilly was an early form of rock and roll, an upbeat combination of blues and country music. The number 2, 3 and 4 songs on Billboard's charts for that year were Elvis Presley, Heartbreak Hotel, Johnny Cash, I Walk the Line, and Carl Perkins' Blue Suede Shoes. Cash and Presley placed songs in the top 5 in 1958 with No. 3, Guess Things Happened That Way, Come In, Stranger by Cash, and No. 5 by Presley, Don't I Beg of You. Presley acknowledged the influence of rhythm and blues artists and his style, saying, "The colored folk been singin' and playin' it just the way I'm doin' it now, man, for more years than I know." But he also said, "My stuff is just hopped up country." Within a few years, many rockabilly musicians returned to a more mainstream style or had defined their own unique style. Country music gained national television exposure through Ozark Jubilee on ABC TV and radio from 1955 to 1960 from Springfield, Missouri. The program showcased top stars including several rockabilly artists, some from the Ozarks. As Webb Pierce put it in 1956, "Once upon a time, it was almost impossible to sell country music in a place like New York City. Nowadays, television takes us everywhere and country music records and sheet music sell as well in large cities as anywhere else." The late 1950s saw the emergence of Buddy Holly, but by the end of the decade, backlash as well as traditional artists such as Ray Price, Marty Robbins, and Johnny Horton began to shift the industry away from the rock and roll influences of the mid-1950s. The Nashville and countrypolitan sounds beginning in the mid-1950s and reaching its peak during the early 1960s. The Nashville sound turned country music into a multi-million-dollar industry centered in Nashville, Tennessee, under the direction of producers such as Chet Atkins, Paul Cohen, Owen Bradley, Bob Ferguson, and later Billy Sherrill. The sound brought country music to a diverse audience and helped revive country as it emerged from a commercially fallow period. This subgenre was notable for borrowing from 1950s pop stylings, a prominent and smooth vocal, backed by a string section and vocal chorus. Instrumental soloing was emphasized in favor of trademark licks. Leading artists in this genre included Jim Reeves, Skeeter Davis, The Browns, Patsy Cline, and Eddie Arnold. The slip-note piano style of session musician Floyd Kramer was an important component of this style. Nashville's pop song structure became more pronounced and it morphed into what was called countrypolitan. Countrypolitan was aimed straight at mainstream markets, and it sold well throughout the later 1960s into the early 1970s. Top artists included Tammy Wynette, Lynn Anderson, and Charlie Rich, as well as such former hard country artists as Ray Price and Marty Robbins. Despite the appeal of the Nashville sound, many traditional country artists emerged during this period and dominated the genre. Loretta Lynn, Merle Haggard, Buck Owens, Porter Wagoner, and Sonny James among them. Country soul crossover. In 1962, Ray Charles surprised the pop world by turning his attention to country and western music, topping the charts and rating number 3 for the year on Billboard's pop chart with the "I Can't Stop Loving You" single, and recording the landmark album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music. The Bakersfield sound, another genre of country music, grew out of hardcore honky-tonk with elements of western swing and originated 112 miles north-northwest of Los Angeles in Bakersfield, California, influenced by one-time West Coast residents Bob Wills and Lefty Frizzell. By 1966 it was known as the Bakersfield sound. It relied on electric instruments and amplification, in particular the Telecaster electric guitar, more than other subgenres of country of the era, and can be described as having a sharp, hard, driving, no-frills, edgy flavor. Leading practitioners of this style were Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, Tommy Collins, Gary Allan, and Win Stewart, each of whom had his own style. Decline of Western music and the cowboy ballad. By the late 1960s, Western music, in particular the cowboy ballad, was in decline, relegated to the country and western genre by marketing agencies. Popular Western recording stars released albums to only moderate success. Rock and roll artists got hit songs, but Western artists also got country hits. The latter was largely limited to Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, and a few other bands. In the process, country and western music as a genre lost most of its southwestern, ranchera, and Tejano musical influences. However, the cowboy ballad and honky-tonk music would be resurrected and reinterpreted in the 1970s with the growth in popularity of outlaw country music from Texas and Oklahoma.